My name is Pat Teasdale, and my grandfather has a connection to the Minia, which was the second cable ship sent from Halifax to recover bodies from Titanic in April of 1912. We are today in Evergreen, which is a historic home, part of the Dartmouth Heritage Museum in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, Canada. The Minia was a very old ship at the time that my grandfather came to be on it. It actually had been built in 1866. So in 1912, the ship was about 45 years old. The Minia was owned by the Anglo-American Telegraph Company, and it was leased to Western Union. My grandfather's name was Francis Dyke. He was born in Farringdon in Berkshire, England in 1892 in an upper-class family. This is his father, George John Dyke, and his mother, Cordelia Dyke, and his brothers, Jack and George. He was tutored by private tutors at home. Then he attended a private boarding school, and to complete his education, he studied wireless in England. Minia actually received one of the wireless messages from Cape Race, Newfoundland, and this gave the coordinates of Titanic's sinking, which led the captain of the Minia to believe that they were actually closer to Minia than they were. And it was thought at first that the Minia might be able to go and rescue survivors. But a second distress call that came through reported the actual coordinates. They were not close enough to be able to go and rescue survivors, so Minia returned to Halifax, having completed its cable job in the North Atlantic. Several days after Minia came back to Halifax, they were also hired by the White Star Line to recover bodies from Titanic. So Minia had to load up in Halifax. They loaded up 150 coffins. They loaded up ice and iron, and apparently, from what I have found out, all of that had to be just kind of thrown in where the cable was already stored because there was no time to remove the cable. My grandfather was second electrician on Minia at this time. He would have worked in tandem with the chief electrician, and his job was to receive messages and transmit messages that came through, and it appears that he was quite diligent doing that. While he was on Minia, he started a letter to his mother in England. This is Cordelia Dyke, that's Francis's mother. She was in England. She had not wanted him to go to sea, and this very beautiful letter starts with, "My darling mother." And he's describing how they had been out in the North Atlantic working on a cable repair when they got the message that Titanic sank. When they returned to Halifax, he describes the loading of the cable ship, the supplies, all of these things. When they reached the sinking site, the weather was very bad. So a lot of fog and wind and cold weather, and they started right away to look for bodies. He describes how some of the bodies were about even 130 miles away from the sinking site. When they passed over the site where Titanic sank, Reverend Cunningham, who was on board, conducted a service in the saloon to sort of give tribute to the souls who had perished, and my grandfather thought this was a lovely thing to do. He's only 20 at the time, so it's quite a mature letter too, is what I find the more that I read it. It was quite an experience for him. At one point he says he hopes that he would never have to come on a voyage like this again because it was so difficult for all the cable men on there. Let me read you a little bit from my grandfather's letter. He talks about the Mackie Bennett a little bit. He says when the Mackie Bennett arrived, they picked up over 200 bodies. He also talks about the Mackie Bennett picking up J.J. Astor's body and some other well-known people. And then the Minia begins their search. He says, "The first body we picked up was Charles M. Hayes, president of the Grand Trunk Railway. It was no trouble to identify him, as he had a lot of papers on him and a watch with his name on it. and his leather gloves are in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. They were picked up by Minia, so they would have been donated by some family member of a crew member on Minia. And the next day he talks about they picked up 10 more bodies yesterday. They were mostly waiters and sailors. He had continued this letter on May the 3rd and says, "Just a few lines to let you know how things are going. I honestly hope I shall never have to come on another expedition like this, as it is far from pleasant. The doctor and I are sleeping in the middle of 14 coffins for the time being. They are all stacked around our quarters aft. The Titanic must have blown up when she sank, as we have picked up pieces of the grand staircase, and most of the wreckage is from below. It must have been an awful explosion, too, as some of the main deck planking, 4 feet thick, was all split and broken off short." We're very lucky that the letter is very safely preserved here at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum. What we feel is the way it came here was my grandfather donated it at a time when many residents of Dartmouth were giving things to be gathered up for the beginning of the Dartmouth Heritage Museum. My grandfather, having been born in England, but he met my grandmother here, so that is how he was in Canada and remained the rest of his life here. When we were growing up, we knew that he was on the Minia, and we knew he was on other cable ships, but we did not know about this letter until about 1992, and this would have been about 20 years after he passed away. My mother and some other family members were visiting the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax, viewing the Titanic display. And all of a sudden my mother looked up and saw this quote. It had the name F.R. Dyke. And she asked the people at the museum where they had obtained this. She said, "Francis Dyke was my father. Where did you get that quote?" And they said to her, "Well, it's from a letter which is owned by the Dartmouth Heritage Museum in Dartmouth." We were able to view the letter and get copies of it and find out this great treasure which our family greatly appreciates knowing about. I was very pleased while doing my research about Granddad's time on the Minia to find this copy of the Agreement and Account of Crew, which would be where the crew members signed on to the various cable ships. This one that I have in my hands now is the one which shows us that Francis signed on to Minia in Halifax in 1912, and that he was on that ship from January 1912 to June of 1912. So this places him on the voyage of Minia in the recovery of bodies from Titanic. The small picture frame is actually made from a piece of wreckwood of Titanic. The wreckwood was picked up and it was made into this frame by the ship's carpenter, William Parker, and given to my grandfather. When we asked him where that had come from, he said that was wood from Titanic and it was from his time on the Minia. But that's the only thing he ever said. I did have this authenticated for me, that it's definitely the work of William Parker, and that it's the type of wood that would have been used on Titanic for trim around doorways and framing and things like that. It's a very small frame that is also a treasure of our family. It's in our private collection. There is a photograph of the crew of Minia. My grandfather is seated in the front row on the floor on the far left. It's probably around the time of Titanic. He spent his whole career on the seas, on the cable ships, and he had a great interest in the work and the technology. He passed away in May of 1972. Actually, he passed away in England on one of the last visits to his last surviving brother, and he is buried in England. If you are ever visiting Dartmouth, I would invite you to visit Evergreen House on Newcastle Street here in Dartmouth. It's a Victorian home built in 1867. and it was actually for a number of years the home of Dr. Helen Creighton, who was a world-renowned folklorist. But you'll learn a lot here at Evergreen about the history of Dartmouth, the culture, the society over the years, and it's a fascinating place to visit. I am a volunteer of the Dartmouth Heritage Museum, and I'm also a member of the Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada, which is a great organization. It does a lot of great work promoting the memory of Titanic, the history of Titanic, and you get to meet a lot of people from around the world with many different interests connected to Titanic.
A special thank you to our supporters on Patreon, including Nikki Chan 92, Dean McIntosh, Evan Fleming, Lucas Sidlowski, Bluebird Nut, Martin Cahill, Sam Forker, Mark Gegenheimer, Maximilian Metcalf, Rachel Warner Sanchez, and Snow Monkey.